everyone, welcome back to the Faculty of Psych. As mentioned in last week's video, this week we will be taking a look at some of the differing major schools of psychological thought. As a point of departure, please remember, each school of thought emerged as a product of its unique time and place of origin, while still other schools emerged in direct opposition to the ones that preceded it. Therefore, it would be biased for us to evaluate people and theories out of their context and according to present-day values. Such presentism would risk losing sight of the value of each theory towards our understanding more and more how the pieces of human consciousness, cognitive processes, behavior, and emotion fit together. The good news is, new schools of thought will continue to emerge, increasing our psychological understanding. This should free your creativity and academic aspirations, because if you disagree with a lecturer or a particular school of thought, by all means, investigate, research, test, and develop new theories of your own in your postgraduate work in order to challenge those perspectives you disagree with in a way that is based on sound academic thought and writing. That being said, let's begin. Structuralism. The founder of the structuralist school was Wilhelm Wundt, who was interested in the consciousness of people and intent on establishing a field of science to study these mental processes, but one which was distinct from philosophy. Inspired by the physical sciences of that era, structuralism was focused on identifying the various elements displayed by human consciousness. These elements included sensations, attention, feelings, and perception. Wundt and his fellow structuralists considered consciousness to be a process, a constant mental activity people were aware of, and can describe through a description of their sensations, mental imagery, and emotional experiences after exposure to a specific external stimuli. Edward Titchener, a student of Wundt hailing from Oxford University, discovered approximately 44,000 sensations which could be elicited through external sensory stimuli. To study these elements, Wundt developed the process of analytical introspection, in essence, a practiced form of self-observation. Immediate experiences were described as objectively as possible after being exposed to a certain stimuli, such as light, sound, or touch. These descriptions would then be analyzed. A major objection and drawback to structuralism was that it was laborious, requiring time-consuming analysis and several thousand observations to be successful at identifying patterns. Further, self-observations were considered unreliable and impossible to verify. A final limitation worth mentioning was that structuralism asked limited questions about human experience, failing to answer anything about the relationship between conscious experience and human behavior. Functionalism, behaviorism, and Gestalt psychology emerged in direct opposition to structuralism for this major reason. School number 2, Functionalism. The Functionalist school was primarily American, founded by William James. Functionalism believed that humans have a consciousness, allowing them to perform functions necessary to better adapt to their environment. Such thinking was inspired by Charles Darwin's work in his book On the Origin of Species, outlining how survival was best predicted by species that were best able to adapt to their specific environment. Such thinking caused psychology to focus on individual differences particularly. The study of individual differences was pioneered by Francis Galton, who investigated such differences through the methodical application of ability tests, questionnaires, and statistical analysis. Consciousness for functionalism was considered a continuous stream, personal and unique to each person, changing and evolving over time in a necessary response to the changing environment, thus facilitating survival. There was a definite relationship between what an individual thinks, perceives, and feels, and how they adapt their behavior. Unlike structuralism, focusing on the elements of consciousness, functionalism focused on how and why consciousness allows people to adapt to their environment. Informal self-introspection outside of the laboratory was used to observe how consciousness relates to real-life behavior. Functionalists also realized that adaptive behavior was promoted by a person's learning and skill acquisition, which differed from person to person in terms of ability. An objection to the approach was that functionalists overemphasized the passive adaptive functioning of consciousness for survival. This is clearly not the only function of consciousness. As humans actively plan and change their environment without the goal of survival. For example, people may build homes with the idea of safety and survival, but the style, furnishing, and choice of color schemes clearly have little to do with survival. School number 3, behaviorism. John B. Watson was the acknowledged leader of the behaviorist school. Watson believed that psychology could not become a respected science so long as introspection was the method of study. Behaviorists believed that people do have a consciousness, but it was beyond objective study and description. What could be objectively studied, however, was human and animal behavior under controlled conditions. Behavior is referred to as responses and are related to environmental conditions called stimuli for the behaviorists. Like the naturalists described in last week's video, behaviorists had no interest in the subjective experience of a stimulus, nor how the experience affected the subject's behavior. Heredity was likewise dismissed. In essence, the focus was studying behavior purely as a result of environmental occurrences or stimuli. Psychology for behaviorists needed to be able to control, predict, and explain behavior. Stringent experimental conditions were created to test these hypotheses. Lower animals such as birds, rats, and chimps were often used during experimentation, and behavioral findings were then more or less generalized to human beings. A famous precursory influence to behaviorist methodology was Ivan Pavlov, a physiologist specializing in animal behavior. Pavlov won a Nobel Prize in 1904 for demonstrating that animal behavior could be conditioned through mental associations mechanically arising through stimulus-response relationships, such as inducing the salivation in dogs by the sound of a bell or footsteps of their feeder, even in the absence of food, once the stimulus response was sufficiently conditioned. Behaviorism was criticized for generalizing from animal behavior, as humans possess a consciousness, and what happens in consciousness influences perception and behavior. For critics, this is ignoring the essence of what makes us human. People experience situations subjectively to others and then act accordingly. After Watson came neo-behaviorists, such as B.F. Skinner, along with behavioral concepts, which we will discuss in a video dedicated to behaviorism. School number 4, Gestalt Psychology. Gestalt psychology originated in Germany under Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka, and Wolfgang Kohler. For them, consciousness was also the focus of study. Consciousness comprised for Gestalt psychology not merely a collection of simple elements, but elements forming a structured whole, or Gestalt, German for wholeness, or form, or configuration. Therefore, the wholeness of experience was necessary for it to be perceived meaningfully. The Gestalt is what the person experiences initially, and the simple elements of experience are what can be analyzed afterwards. There is a famous Gestalt saying, "The wholeness of consciousness is greater than the sum of its parts." Consider the examples of the smiling and frowning faces shown on the slide. They consist of simple elements which in their current arrangement allow us to interpret a whole or Gestalt of a smiling or frowning expression. But compare the faces to the circles below them. They consist of exactly the same shape elements arranged in a disorganized way, and thus the Gestalt or whole can no longer be recognized meaningfully, proving we perceive something as more than its simple constituent elements. Likewise, in the picture with the spots below it, due to its arrangement as a whole, the image allows us to interpret a Dalmatian in the middle of the picture. Gestalt research methods make use of informal introspection and also experimentation to test their hypotheses. Many experiments were done on learning, memory, motivation, and thinking. A famous example was Kohler's chimpanzee problem-solving experiment, where chimps were presented with a banana suspended by a string, well out of reach. The chimps were simultaneously provided with crates strewn randomly around the room. The chimps solved the problem of reaching the banana by stacking the crates on top of each other. The chimps thus reorganized the stimulus field, in other words the boxes, into a meaningful whole, or Gestalt, in the form of a crude ladder which they could climb. The major shift caused by Gestalt theory was the considering of the integrated whole of human functioning. But this focus on the whole led to the realization that the major problem with Gestalt thought was it was a significant challenge, if not impossible, to describe the whole of an experience and the interaction of its various elements accurately. School 5. Psychoanalysis. No school of psychology is more widely known than classical analysis, most commonly referred to as psychoanalysis. The founder, Sigmund Freud, is equally famous. Freud was an intellectual giant and produced the most complete theory of human development and personality to date. Freud has been massively influential in our field, and his work influences psychology heavily to this day. Freud developed his theories in late 19th century Vienna, a time characterized by considerable puritanical inhibitions. Freud began to believe his patients were victims of self-alienation and self-negation through fearing people may learn who they truly are. Through talking with his patients, Freud began to suspect that many of the physical ailments of his patients related to repressed sexuality, aggression, and childhood experiences. The more Freud's theory developed, the more he became convinced that the thoughts, feelings, and desires troubling his patients were essentially out of their awareness, or in other words, unconscious. For Freud, what people dreamt, did consciously or accidentally, was the expression of unconscious wishes, desires, and thoughts. This major shift in emphasis towards unconscious processes led to the main premise of Freud's theory taking shape, namely, that unconscious processes were the main determinants of our behavior. The main task of psychoanalysis in therapy was to make unconscious material governing our behavior conscious in order to determine the true underlying cause of the patient's problems and help them resolve these problems through gaining insights about them. The method psychoanalysts like Freud used to make unconscious material conscious was through free association and dream analysis. Free association encouraged patients to informally introspect and talk about whatever came to mind for them. It was suspected that as thoughts began to flow freely, one thought would be linked to the next, linking all the way back to the unconscious, and the psychoanalyst would then take note of and interpret the patterns and links found in this free association against the backdrop of the patient's problems. By making patients consciously aware of these links and patterns, it would allow them to not be held captive any longer by them and live more rational lives. Dream analysis involved considering and interpreting the elements of the patient's dreams which were considered to be latent material emerging from the unconscious while the patient slept. The psychoanalytic approach allowed psychologists to ask new questions about new phenomena for the first time, but has been heavily critiqued for being deterministic, focusing too heavily on interpretation of unconscious material. Many critics were not satisfied with the negative-seeming idea that people become the product of unconscious processes out of their control and shaped by often long-forgotten experiences. Since Freud, different psychoanalytically grounded schools emerged, holding the view of the importance of the unconscious and childhood experiences, but placing less emphasis on sexuality, while including a focus on the future and social factors. These so-called neo-Freudians will be discussed in a future video on Freud and psychoanalysis. School 6. Humanism. Humanism developed in the USA, while its European equivalent, phenomenology, developed during the 1960s as a reaction to behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Humanists rejected the notion of people being machines reacting to stimuli, or that humans were maladjusted products of past unconscious experiences. The humanistic focus is on the positive aspects of human nature, such as striving for growth, actualization, and individual autonomy or independence. The phenomenological views of Europe originated in the existentialist thinking of Brentano, Kierkegaard, Husserl, and Heidegger, who considered humans to possess free will, set their own goals, and are responsible for their own choices. Such considerations cannot be measured objectively, but rather understood through subjective thought, feelings, and experiences. For humanists, psychology should thus focus on helping individuals understand themselves, their experiences, and to become their authentic selves with a positive self-image and find meaning in their lives. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who survived the horrors of the Holocaust during the Second World War, noted that even during those horrors, people still strove to find dignity and meaning in their lives. We will dedicate a video to Viktor Frankl and logotherapy at a later stage, however. Humanists use systematic introspection and eidetic reduction to research human experiences. Eidetic reduction meant progressively reducing mental images that emerge during introspection in order to focus on specific experiences with greater resolution to discover the real issues bothering clients while eliminating irrelevant conscious material. For example, a therapist may, while assisting a client to systematically introspect regarding childhood memories, use eidetic reduction to construe memories of childhood poverty as meaningless. and eliminate these mental images, reducing them constantly towards focusing on the patient's childhood experiences of their parents' love, kindness, and care, despite the impoverished context. A caveat on humanism though. I learned at my own expense while making this video that despite its good-natured intent, humanism has a dismissive and cynical view of religious beliefs, which may offend those with strong religious views or values. Please bear this in mind for multicultural and interfaith practice. School 7. Cognitive Psychology. Cognitive psychology emerged in the 1960s and has remained a major force in psychology to date. The basic premise is that humans are problem solvers and can be understood best by examining how they evaluate and process stimuli in order to solve specific problems. The word cognitive comes from the Latin word cogitare, meaning to think or to know. Cognitive psychology accordingly emphasizes the factors by which one knows, such as thinking, intelligence, memory, learning, and perception. Ultimately, this school wants to know how stimuli is organized into information in the mind. The mind is seen almost like a computer, which processes and integrates inputs of stimuli into the output of knowledge in terms of how best to regulate and plan our behavior. Instead of the stimulus-response perspective of behavioralism, the cognitive school does consider inputs and outputs, but emphasizes the intermediate processing of inputs into outputs. For the cognitive school, consciousness is studied as a function of the mind, as a coherent system, and not individual elements. The processing of inputs into outputs is the reason for the changeability and variability in people, especially as inputs change and people need to adapt to produce outputs necessary to attain their needs in spite of changes in the environment, leading to more input changes. School number 8, Metapsychology. Metapsychology is a current trend in psychology, often referred to as eclectic or integrative practice. In this school, there is no strict adherence to any particular approach, but rather an emphasis on combining complementary concepts and methods from different schools of thought in order for them to be more useful and account for more of human nature than any one school may do on its own. Metapsychology also focuses on discourse regarding psychological factors, diversity, and contextualization, whereby psychological factors are placed in their proper physical, social, economic, and cultural context. Lastly, the transcendental environment of people, including religion and philosophy, is also considered. School number 9, Postmodernism. Postmodernism is an interdisciplinary school of thought, drawing heavily on literature, philosophy, art, architecture, and politics. It is essentially a cultural movement and very prevalent in the humanities today, despite being undefined and having little empirical support. Speaking of empirical, postmodernism emerged as a rejection of the modernist naturalistic school described in last week's video, which emerged in the late 19th century, focusing predominantly on producing new knowledge via the scientific method. Postmodernism rejects the idea of any true fundamental reality in the humanities, as societies and cultures are simply too diverse. For postmodernists, psychology should focus on the subjective experience of socio-cultural factors of that time, the human mind is considered unpredictable and fluid as social conditions change continuously. Despite their view of unpredictable behavior, postmodernists make sense of contradictions and differences between groups and people by viewing identity as being determined by membership of a specific social group. Further, all cultural phenomena can be understood as constructions or discourses allowing spoken and written language to serve as research material to investigate how phenomena are constructed and reconstructed and referred to over time. There are three forms of construction in the postmodern school. Number one, deconstructionism. Deconstructionism involves reading the texts and ascribing new meaning to them. Texts refer to any cultural product that can be put into language, not just written sources. Jacques Derrida asserted that there can be differences between what the text says versus what it actually means, and can be layered with multiple interpretations beyond what is presented at face value, especially across cultures. Deconstructionism aims to subvert or overturn the traditionally held meanings of binary or dichotomous terms, such as good and evil, male and female, truth and lies, and lastly, morality and immorality, for example. This allows deconstructionists to construct or reinterpret the past and present. The second form or pillar of postmodernism is constructivism, whose main advocate was George Kelly. George Kelly and his adherents focused on how individuals construct their own subjective personal beliefs about reality and the meanings they ascribe to social and cultural phenomena. Behavior for them is essentially a product of internal constructs, and as people are proactive, their actions are not simply reactions to external stimuli. The individual's constructs can be understood via dialogue, which allows a shared meaning to be constructed, and further meanings to be constructed through this process of reciprocal meaning making, leading to unexpected meanings emerging between the two parties. The third pillar of postmodernism, or form, is referred to as social constructionism. Headed by Kenneth Gurdjieff, social constructionism focuses on the acquisition of knowledge and meaning through social interaction. People do construct themselves as mentioned for constructivism, but they and their knowledge or meaning they attach to phenomena can be reconstructed by their interactions with others in their social group, or by their cultural, political, and historical context. Discourse analysis is the method of study used to interrogate autobiographies or stories people tell about themselves. The stories people tell about themselves are useful as people look into themselves to find their own meaning or configurations of what they are experiencing. The value of Gestalt psychology interpretations are also useful in these constructions. Postmodernism as a whole does provide us with some novel ways of seeing the world and human nature or behavior. It is important to use its questioning of nature, reality, context, and meanings, but we should also apply the same questions to this very theory. It does have some vigorous criticisms and definite shortfalls. As you will encounter this theory many times in various guises throughout your studies, we will produce a video on this theory and sadly have to expose some of its more insidious elements at a later stage. Hopefully, you have enjoyed this brief but thorough explanation of the main points of the various schools of psychological thought. These schools are much larger than could ever be presented in an introductory video of this length. Additionally, there are many additional theorists associated with each of them as well. This means if you are interested in any specific school, there is plenty of research and reading to be done which can satisfy your curiosity. It should also be clear by now, hopefully, that each theory focusing on specific elements of human experience while neglecting others represents a definite shortfall, not to mention being problematic when adherents to a school claim their school of thought is the one true paradigm for understanding human nature, to which they cling rigidly, thus losing out on the possible benefits of more eclectic thinking, such as metapsychology. Please develop your own style, introspect, and determine which theories suit your personality best, but remain flexible to the cross-pollination of ideas from different schools to overcome the shortfalls of the schools you prefer. When we move into second year level psychology theory, which focuses on development and personality, we will explore the most relevant of these theories and how their view of development shapes us in exciting detail. This is where you will most likely begin to compare theories to experiences you have had in your own life in order to understand them. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing it with a friend, a classmate, lecturer, or psychologist to help grow the channel and to reach more people. Thanks again for watching, Psych Squad. Until next time, I wish you good mental health. Bye for now.